Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
In this week's episode, we're looking at what is one of the very small number of genuine near misses of attacks and attempts to try and kill the British Prime Minister. We'll be thinking in particular about the Brighton bomb, which was a provisional IRA, the Irish Republican Army, attempt to murder Margaret Thatcher and much of her cabinet, but ended up murdering other people instead. It's probably one of only two times, I think, really, that terrorists have got quite close to killing the Prime Minister. The other probably being the mortar attack on 10 Downing Street in February of 1991.
Of course, there were other attacks on Parliament. In 1974, a bomb was set off in Parliament by the IRA, and although no one died, and therefore we could say that the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, was not necessarily at risk, I'm sure the IRA wouldn't have been too disappointed had the Prime Minister happened to be at that location in Parliament at the time. So it's clear that the IRA saw assassination as part of their terrorist campaign, and many British MPs did die at the hands of the IRA. We talked about in an earlier episode about Mary Neave, Margaret Thatcher's shadow Northern Ireland secretary, who was killed on the eve of her election in 1979 when the INLA, another Irish terrorist group, blew up Mary Neave in his car as he was driving out of the car park in Parliament. And maybe that's a good place to begin to think about the situation in Northern Ireland. So Thatcher has now been Prime Minister for 5 years, over 5 years at this point. She's in her second term. And what has been her approach to the unrest in Northern Ireland over that period?
Yeah, so the period we're talking about really is October 1984. And like you say, Margaret Thatcher is pretty well established as Prime Minister by this time. It isn't the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but they are certainly still ongoing. So it's only 5 years since, like you mentioned, Mary Neave was murdered in the Palace of Westminster. Later that same year, by this stage, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Lord Mountbatten was assassinated. On the very same day, 18 British soldiers were murdered at Warren Point. And in 1983, there was an IRA bomb at Harrods, the large department store in London, in which 6 people died, 3 members of the police and 3 members of the public. So certainly by this stage in the 1980s, the IRA campaigns were taking place both in Northern Ireland itself, but also in Great Britain too. And so it was very impossible for anybody who lives in the United Kingdom, and certainly the British political class, to turn a blind eye to what was happening in Ulster. Some of the other things which are really important bits of context to this period regarding Northern Ireland. In the early 1980s, there was the hunger strikes over the status of terrorists in Northern Ireland prisons. Basically, they wanted to be identified as political prisoners, and this would have come with enhanced treatment in terms of not having to wear uniforms, for example, and being given freer rights of association, among other things, whilst they were interned. Margaret Thatcher had a very strict view, which was basically that criminals were criminals were criminals, and the fact that they ultimately cited a political cause as their motivation did not change how they ought to be treated in prison. Now, she is ultimately remembered as being very tough, almost uncaring about this, and there was a movement to go on hunger strike, which people thought would shame the British government and shame her into conceding to those demands. But she was unwilling to do so. And ultimately, people died in the hunger strike. They literally starved themselves to death as part of this protest.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Of course, Margaret Thatcher is remembered for this. I think in sort of popular rendering of this now, it's seen as a particularly cruel move on her part, certainly by her critics. But I think it's worth remembering that the Labour Party supported her in this. Michael Foot, the leader of the Labour Party, a very left-wing figure in Labour's history, nonetheless agreed that her position was correct, that if you said that members of the IRA who were imprisoned in Northern Ireland were political prisoners, then this would only act as a recruiting mechanism, an incentive for others to join the IRA, to shield them. A lot of the activities of these Republican terrorist groups were being funded through illicit activities, particularly the drug trade. There was a lot of gangsterism that was supporting them. And basically, the view was you would get people who were drug dealers, who were thieves, people who had committed other crimes, and then would try to shield themselves from the full consequences of their crimes by saying, oh, well, actually, I'm in the IRA. So now I think it's seen, obviously, it was controversial at the time, but it wasn't actually seen in a partisan lens. It wasn't Labour saying that Thatcher was wrong to take that particular position.
Absolutely. It's really unimaginable what other position the British government could have adopted on political status of terrorists. One slight caveat it is worth making on this is that Margaret Thatcher had a general tendency, I think, on Northern Ireland to talk tough but act more softly or rather pragmatically. Two examples of that. One of them is that during the hunger strikes, she did sanction secret talks with the IRA about how to bring the hunger strikes to an end. But perhaps the more significant example is that it's during this period in the early mid-1980s that discussions are underway with the Republic of Ireland that would ultimately lead in 1985 to the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So these discussions began at the beginning of the decade, and although Thatcher was herself a very instinctive unionist, these talks were basically about conceding that the Republic of Ireland had some interest, possibly even say, in the governance of Northern Ireland. And so really when she's in office, she goes on this journey from having what are sometimes described as quite integrationist views. These are the views that Éire Neave, before he died, held, for example, where Northern Ireland ought not be treated differently to any other part of the United Kingdom and ought to be integrated as much as possible into the general affairs of the United Kingdom. But by this stage, she's really looking at what ultimately developed, which is to treat Northern Ireland as being a separate part of the United Kingdom with a distinct form of governance and also a distinct constitutional position as well. And so whilst
Which is
this is remembered as a time in which Republicans and Irish nationalists are incredibly angry at her and see her as being evil, it is just before a lot of Ulster Unionists, they are the people, in fact, who she would really anger. And so there's this slight misremembering, I think, of history where she's sometimes seen as being a fierce and staunch unionist, but really she was quite, some could say, pragmatic, others may choose to say unprincipled when it came to Northern Ireland.
And Ian Paisley would say, never, never, never. So let's zoom out a little bit and consider Margaret Thatcher's wider political position at this stage in the autumn of 1984. So, as I mentioned, she's in her second term, so she had decisively won the 1983 general election, a very bad defeat for Labour, a very good win for the Conservatives. The Conservatives are riding high in the polls, and I suppose if you are someone who hates Margaret Thatcher and you want to see her out of 10 Downing Street, the prospect of being able to do so through legitimate democratic means does not look like it's just around the corner.
No, I would think that's probably right. I mean, Charles Moore, in his 3-volume authorised biography of Margaret Thatcher, gave the title to the second book, which covers this period, Everything She Wants, which is, of course, both a song by Wham, but also a characterisation, really, of her political power at this time. The one challenge to that is that this is also one of the moments of strife for the government, and it's also the moment when something is going on in Britain which previously has brought down prime ministers and even governments, and that is that there is a miners' strike going on. So, in fact, the immediate context for the Brighton bombing and the 1984 Conservative Conference is that the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM, are still engaged in this mass walkout and strike to try and bring the country to its knees, basically, in order to resist the government's plans for coal mining in this country. And by the end of the year, really, it's not so much in doubt the way that is ultimately going to end. I think the government in a much stronger position than, say, Ted Heath's government was in the early 1970s. But still, this is a time of some political risk and challenge for her with the NUM and the miners. But alongside that, it's also the point at which she is implementing some of the most memorable and distinctive Thatcherite policies, such as privatisation. And it's at this stage that she has probably her most successful, certainly I would say most politically distinctive Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, who is moving ahead with his changes to the UK economy in the mid-1980s.
But let's get to the event itself. So, first of all, this is a bomb that goes off in the Grand Hotel in Brighton. It's on the seafront of Brighton. The hotel's still there. I have been to that hotel when the Labour Party has held party conferences in Brighton. It's still used as one of the main conference hotel venues. Not that I've actually stayed in it, but I've had a drink in there for sure. So how do the IRA manage to get a bomb into the hotel where the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the senior members of the Conservative Party will all be staying?
Yeah, so this is the days when the Conservative Party conference is basically a seaside jamboree. So it's going usually between venues like Blackpool and Bournemouth and Brighton. Certainly in the Conservative case, they now alternate between Manchester and Birmingham. But that certainly wasn't the case, back then. And 2 years earlier, in 1982, the Conservatives had also been in Brighton for their conference, and in 1983 they'd been in Blackpool. Probably the most popular and recurring conference venue for the Tories in the post-war period. And the reason why I mention those last two party conferences is that operatives for the IRA had been to those venues shortly before the Tory conference in 82 and 83 to basically do some reconnaissance work on how those hotels functioned. And in 1983, one of the people who went to Blackpool was in fact the person who would ultimately plant the bomb in the Grand Hotel in Brighton the following year. So the bomb was planted more than 3 weeks earlier, before the conference began, by an established IRA operative with a criminal record who had a long pedigree, really, in Republican terrorism. And this was really his big mission, to go to the Grand Hotel. He checked in under a false name, Roy Walsh, which was also the name of a former IRA operative who was convicted in the early 1970s. This is something that Republican terrorists quite liked to do, probably felt quite smug about doing, that they would not use their real name, but they would use the quite bland-sounding name of another Republican terrorist. But the way in which he got into the Grand Hotel is he simply turned up with the bomb and asked for a room with a sea view.
I assume the bomb was in a suitcase.
Yes, not visible, and also wrapped in plastic as well. So the explosives had this very distinctive almond-like smell, apparently. So it was quite heavily wrapped in plastic so that it could easily be detected. But yes, and one of the real moments of chance in this entire story are that it's perfectly possible that the hotel would have turned around to him and said, "I'm sorry, we're fully booked." Or that they could have said to him, because he didn't have an advance booking, "We've only got certain rooms available," and they weren't the type of room that he wanted, or they would have been in a part of the hotel that was not particularly risky to other visitors. But nevertheless, he gets given room 629. It is said that they were quite happy with this allocation of room, because they imagined that, in part because what were the anticipated security fears caused by protesters about the miners' strike, they thought that Margaret Thatcher would be put in a room quite high up in the conference hotel, but in fact she would end up being on the first floor. So the bomb went into the side panel of a bathtub in room 629, and there it was put on a timer to go off in just over 3 weeks' time. The most obvious question, of course, was that you're about to have a major security operation take place the Prime Minister, the entire cabinet. It's an obvious security risk. You've had the atrocities that we've mentioned, the murder of MPs, car bombs outside department stores. Why did the security services not find this bomb? Well, what appears to have been the case is that there were no specific security risks identified about the venue or at the time. Of course, the British state had infiltrated the IRA in large part. The IRA had gone through some internal reorganization to try and mitigate that. Arguably, these events are a sign that that reorganization was quite effective in terms of reducing the level of intelligence that the British could get out of their people in the IRA. And without this suspicion that something was about to happen, they only sent sniffer dogs and security into the first floor, the very floor where the Prime Minister and most of the senior principal figures were staying. Now, of course, that was a totally daft strategy. For security, if a bomb had gone off on the second floor, it would have done just as much damage as if it had gone on next door to where the Prime Minister was. But nevertheless, that was their limited approach to pre-conference security, and what that effectively meant is that the bomb lay there undisturbed but ticking away as Margaret Thatcher, as her government, and as the Conservative Party conference arrived in Brighton.
It's an extraordinary thing to think that the murderers had the bomb there for 3 weeks, over 3 weeks before the conference, that they didn't know the room that the Prime Minister was staying in. And that was a fact that, as we were preparing for this podcast, I hadn't quite appreciated before, that I had always thought that they had been tipped off as to which room the Prime Minister would be staying in. Like it would be some kind of, Queen's suite or Prime Ministerial suite or President's suite or whatever. And that they had booked that out, or they booked a room just above or just below that. But what becomes clear is they're just taking a guess. And really, actually, for them to be successful, they have to hope that their bomb is absolutely devastating and kills loads of people in order to maximize their chances of killing the Prime Minister. Because if it were a more targeted bombing, let's say it was just a bombing that was meant to just basically kill the occupants of one room or two rooms, then that would have really minimized their chances. So I hadn't realized actually the willingness that they showed to kill many more people as collateral damage in this effort to murder the Prime Minister.
That's very certainly my view. I mean, that this was a largely indiscriminate attack, and concerns about collateral damage were not something that came into it at all, really. It's in that sense that in some ways it's quite questionable about whether or not we should call it an assassination attempt, in the sense that it is not particularly specific or targeted.
Absolutely. I think that point is largely forgotten, but I think you're absolutely right to raise it, Lee. And I think it just adds something to the depravity of the act that these men were willing to commit. So let's get to the moment when the bomb goes off. 3 weeks after the terrorists plant the bomb in room 629. So what happens?
Well, Tory conference lasts for 4 days, and by convention, the leader speaks on the very last day of the conference. That's actually a throwback to an earlier time when party conferences were not themselves organised by professional parts of the party, but were organised by the volunteers wing, what was then called the National Union. So it's by convention that the Prime Minister always speaks on the final day. And it was in the early hours of that final day, shortly before the Prime Minister's speech, at 2:54 a.m., that the bomb detonated. The actual blast of the bomb caused some damage and almost certainly killed a lady who was in the room next door, 628, Lady Shattuck, who was the wife of the Western Area chairman of the party. But what is actually really quite remarkable is that she appears to have been the only person that the blast itself killed. The real damage was done by a 5-ton chimney, which sat atop the hotel, which collapsed and made its way through the building, basically crashing through the floors of the hotel. That's what caused most of the injuries and the deaths. So whilst it may have been unlucky for people to be on the 6th floor, and very near the bomb, actually the really unlucky place to be was any floor below floor 6 that ends 28. So in room 528, just below, was Eric Taylor, the party's Northwest chairman. He was killed. The room below was held by the chief whip, John Wakeham, and his wife Roberta was killed in room 428. In room 328, that was occupied by Sir Anthony Berry, a Conservative MP, the MP for Enfield Southgate. He was killed. And then in room 228, below that, that was the room occupied by Norman Tebbit and his wife Margaret. Now, neither of them were killed, but they were both very severely injured, and she was paralysed for the rest of her life. In there, we've named 4 of the 5 people who were killed, murdered: Lady Shattuck, Eric Taylor, Roberta Wakeham, and Anthony Berry. The final person to die was a lady called Muriel McLean, and she died of her injuries sustained after the explosion around about a month later. So yeah, I think that's one of the important things to note about this, that of course the bomb is what causes all of this damage, and it's horrific, and everybody in the hotel can feel it. The hotel is shaken by the detonation of this bomb. But the real profound damage is done by bits of the building collapsing through the floors of the Grand Hotel.
And I've always thought it quite extraordinary that there wasn't then a subsequent, say, electrical fire that burnt down the whole hotel and could have killed many more people who might have been sleeping or unable to get to a fire escape. I mean, certainly if there had been a fire, I would imagine that Norman and Margaret Tebbit probably would have died because they were trapped under the rubble for hours. And so if there'd been a fire, then surely it would have killed them. So you've gone through these rooms: 628, 528, 428, 328, 228, all of them sustaining deaths or casualties. What room is Margaret Thatcher in?
So Margaret Thatcher is very nearly in the line of fire, or the line of collapse for this chimney making its way through the building. She is in a room pretty much just beneath the Tebbits, called the Napoleon Suite. But her room was in fact very large and had multiple rooms in it. So one part of her suite, the bathroom, was very badly damaged. And had she been there, which she apparently was just minutes beforehand, then she would certainly have been very severely injured. Some people say she may have died. Of course, it's impossible to know, but certainly she would have been injured. As it happens, she wasn't injured at all. So there are quite a few remarkable things about this. One of them is that Margaret Thatcher is up at 2:54 a.m. as the bomb goes off. And she isn't just awake, she's still working. So shortly beforehand, Robin Butler, who would go on to become Cabinet Secretary and is still today a member of the House of Lords, who knows more about British politics and the men and women who occupied senior roles in it than probably anybody else alive today. He was a civil servant working with her at the time, and he had just handed her some paperwork on the Liverpool Garden Festival, which she said that she would look at before she finally went to bed. That's what she's looking at the time that the bomb goes off. It quite quickly becomes clear that, in fact, she, Dennis, who's in bed at the time, all of her staff are actually fine. John Gummer is in an adjoining room where there are secretaries who are working on amendments to her speech, which is due to take place the next day. He goes down on his knees and tries crawling around the space and then pushes open a door to try and see what he can of the wider hotel. As he opens the door, he sees somebody staring back at him, also on their hands and knees, and that's the Prime Minister. He's reassured, obviously, that she is then okay. They can hear some shouts for help, which are coming from the room next door, and that is where Geoffrey and Elspeth Howe are. Now, happily, they are uninjured, but the disfiguring of the hotel caused by the blast and the collapsing parts of the building has basically trapped them in their room because they can't open the door. All around them at this time, of course, there is tremendous chaos and panic. There are lots of people who are still in the bar and drinking and up at the time, who are suddenly rocked by this blast. Happily, most of them are quite easily able to get out of the building. The one person who seems to have been least disturbed by it is a man called Peter Morrison. Now, people who know about the downfall of Margaret Thatcher, or have maybe listened to our episodes on that, will know of Peter Morrison's name. He was a member of Parliament for the city of Chester, which is very near where I grew up. would go on to become Margaret Thatcher's parliamentary private secretary, arguably is the person whose incompetence led to her downfall in November 1990, in part because he was a known drunk, and he was drunk at this time as well. He apparently barely heard the bomb go off, and he assumed it was the Young Conservatives having some party or playing some sort of prank, and tried to go back to sleep. But with the exception of him, there was nobody in the hotel really in any doubt about what had just happened.
Well, I have to say, I don't want to draw too many comparisons between myself and Peter Morrison, but I was thinking, gosh, 3 in the morning at party conference, I'd probably be worse for wear myself.
It's a very, very long time since I've been awake, really later than 1 o'clock in the morning at a party conference. Certainly voluntarily, anyway.
So John Gummer discovers the Prime Minister alive, and it quickly, as you say, becomes clear that her personal immediate staff around her are all alive and okay, and they are evacuated from the hotel, which it must have been in itself still quite a frightening thing to be in that hotel and trying to get out, because obviously a huge part of the hotel has been taken out. You don't know if the hotel is going to collapse on you after these events. It's not just the event itself or even the immediate collapse of masonry, but then potential water leakages, as I mentioned, potential for fire, all these other things that could mean that the whole thing collapses. So you need to get out as soon as possible. And at that stage, I would have thought that certainly in today's world, if something awful like that happened to Keir Starmer, that he would be whisked away by the security services to Downing Street. I assume he wouldn't have a chance probably to necessarily even brief the press, at least at that scene. I'm sure they'd want to take him as far away from that as possible. So is that what happened with Margaret Thatcher in Brighton? Was she whisked away at the soonest possible moment?
Well, I think there were four things that they considered doing at the time. One of them was actually just to stay put for a period. So it wasn't unknown when a bomb went off for there to be another bomb somewhere nearby. Of course, that is often the bomb that can cause the most damage and distress and chaos, because you've got everybody milling around, checking everybody else is okay, and then another bomb detonates. That was a known risk. If this was a particularly organized attack, of course, there was always the risk of other armed people or even snipers who could be there, depending on the scale of the operation. So in part, they wondered if they should stay put just where she was to begin with. Eventually, they settled on the view that she should leave the hotel as soon as possible, and they went out by the back door. But then there were three options about where to go. One of them was to go back to London, like you described, speed back off to 10 Downing Street, just lock down wherever the Prime Minister is, and then let the emergency services and the security services basically clear up the mess, check everybody's okay, get them treated, and find out what had happened. Margaret Thatcher is totally against this view, and Butler, as her most senior civil servant who's with her at the time, is left incredulous by the fact that she doesn't think she should just go straight back to London. An alternative that's floated is to go somewhere secret that people wouldn't know about. So John Gummer, the party chairman, his father had been a vicar in Brighton, and there was a doctor who his father knew, and Gummer suggested that he could call him up and they could go to his house. That's dismissed quite quickly. There was also the suggestion that they could go slightly further afield to Ian Gow's house. Ian Gow was the MP for Eastbourne. That also wasn't taken up, but it is in and of itself a pretty ominous suggestion, as it's at his home that Ian Gow was himself murdered by the IRA in 1990 with a car bomb. So at the time, they don't go there. Where they do go in the end is that they just go off to the nearby police station and then to a police college in Lewes. And it's there that Margaret Thatcher tries to learn the scale of what has happened, who has been injured, who, if anybody, has died, and tries to prepare herself for what to do next.
Of course, when this happens and people have to evacuate the hotel, it's in the middle of the night. The people who are not still up working or drinking have gone to bed. And so in many instances, people are leaving the hotels in their in their night clothes. And then to add to that, they then can't go back to get their day clothes. So perhaps it may seem a bit more of a trivial point, but perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about, practically speaking, for the guests from the hotel, what do they do in the immediate aftermath?
Well, once they know that the bomb has gone off, many people just make their way to the exit. So they're in their dressing gowns, at best, often they're just in their pajamas, but they basically all try and make their way, if they're able to, out of the building. That then becomes one of the slightly complicating factors because it becomes very hard to know really who is injured, who may have died, who is still in the building, and who is accounted for. And this leads to some extraordinary scenes, basically, of party conference delegates, but also members of the government, members of the cabinet even, basically just milling around on the streets of Brighton in their night clothes, with fairly soon afterwards television cameras being pointed in their faces. So there are two that stand out in my mind. One of them is Sir Keith Joseph, the Education Secretary. He is there in quite a grand-looking dressing gown, to be honest, and he is walking around the street as he has a camera pointed in his face and starts being asked questions, and he just sort of puts his hand up and sort of bats them away. Not unreasonably, in this case, given all that's just happened. There's a similar experience with Nigel Lawson, who's in his night clothes and refuses to say anything to the press. It soon emerges that people have died in the building. There were those people that I described earlier, and also that dozens of people are injured. So in the end, 33 people would be treated in hospital. And as Margaret Thatcher is in the police college in Lewes, her assistant, Crawfie, as she always called her, puts on the television early in the morning. It's probably about 10 to 7 in the morning, and suddenly shouts across the room, "It's Tebbit, they're getting him out." And it's at this stage that there are television cameras pointed at the rubble and the collapsing parts of the hotel as Norman Tebbit is being taken out from among the rubble in a really rather injured condition. So he would go straight to hospital. When Margaret Thatcher would try and visit that afternoon, he would be unconscious at the time. He would require surgery. And similarly, it's at this point that they finally get Margaret Tebbit out as well. And she is awake as it happens when the Prime Minister visits that afternoon, but says to the Prime Minister, "I can't feel anything below my waist." And it's at that stage, I think the picture is emerging that she would be paralysed for the remainder of her life. For the conference delegates, who have, like you say, been blown out of their accommodation and have left pretty much everything that they own back there, the Tory Treasurer, Alistair McAlpine, organises for the local Marks and Spencers to open early the next morning so that people can get their clothes for the conference. And at that stage, it's almost as if there's a little bit of blitz spirit going on, this keep calm, carry on idea. And the Tory party, at the very least, paid for the cost of the clothes, apparently, for the people who needed them to get them into the conference hall that day.
You described this event quite rightly as a near miss, but of course, as you've acknowledged, there were many casualties and some deaths. Norman Tebbit in particular, I think, is one to reflect on. We know that Norman Tebbit made a decision after Margaret's paralysis that he would pull back from some of his frontline political responsibilities to be able to care for his wife. And it's quite moving, really. He was, I think, totally devoted to her care for her entire life. And it's been said to me that that bombing effectively killed off his aspirations to become Conservative Party leader. But in some ways, Tebbit would have been perhaps quite a natural successor to Margaret Thatcher as representing something of that more non-patrician, more economically, I would call it economically neoliberal, but, Thatcherite political persuasion. And had the bomb not gone off, I mean, it's very difficult to know, but do you think, Lee, that he might have been a future contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party?
The only challenge I have in agreeing is that, of course, it's more than 6 years until she eventually goes as Prime Minister. And political history is littered with the rise and fall of people who were seemingly destined to be the successor to the throne. And it's perfectly possible that even were it not for him stepping back from frontline politics after the 1987 election to care for his wife, which is a very noble and commendable thing to do, that something else would have intervened that would have made him a less likely successor to her. But certainly at this moment in time, he was very popular with the grassroots. Earlier in the conference, it had this sustained standing ovation from the delegates at the conference. Many in the Tory party liked what he did, for example, when he was at trade and industry. Margaret Thatcher certainly liked and admired him, and there was quite a strong political affinity between the two of them. So certainly one of the certain consequences of this is that it led a few years later to a possible successor leaving frontline politics.
So was it clear immediately that it was the IRA that did this?
Well, the IRA are never that shy, really, in coming forward when they do these things. And so the next day, they did claim credit, as they would put it, for the bomb and issued a statement that said, the IRA claims responsibility for the detonation of 100 pounds of gelignite in Brighton against the British cabinet and Tory warmongers. Thatcher will now realise that Britain cannot occupy our country, torture our prisoners, and shoot our people in their own streets and get away with it. Rather absurd and ludicrous statement, but there we are. It then finishes with what are probably the most memorable words associated with this atrocity, which is, quote, "Today we were unlucky, but remember, we will only have to be lucky once. You will have to be lucky always." And that's a direct reference to their attempt to murder the Prime Minister. And it is quite literally true, of course, that terrorists do only ever have to succeed once in their evil aims in order to snuff out somebody's life altogether. I do think it's worth putting a little bit of context into this. So there is now, I think, this rather unpleasant trend among certain people to almost try and make the IRA out to be quote unquote freedom fighters, or in some sense, something you can joke about. There were those scenes of people chanting "Up the Var" who were in the Republic of Ireland women's football team, for example, and then people laughing it off as if it's just some sort of joke. Two things against that. One, I mean, this is a murderous terrorist organization. In this case, murdering indiscriminately innocent people who happen to be at a political conference. There are many, many more murders, of course, that they would commit. This attempt to almost make light of the IRA and their monstrous crimes now by some people, I think, is pretty outrageous. Second of all, of course, what they say in their statement about occupying our country is really just nonsense, in the sense that very soon after this is that there is the view, now it's law and widely held consensus, certainly I think by people who think about these issues correctly, that the constitutional position of Northern Ireland ought to be settled by the majority of people who live in Northern Ireland. And irrespective of what their statement says, undeniably, at this time, the majority of the people who live in Northern Ireland want to be British. So this idea that the British state is there, or the Tory government is there, as some sort of occupying force against the will of the people who live there, is just simply not true. The majority of the people in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland wish to be part of the United Kingdom, and that is exactly what they were, and that is the democratic position to be in, and that is ultimately the position that was confirmed by the Anglo-Irish Agreement and ultimately the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement about the status of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and often these are people who will accuse Israel of war crimes and being a genocidal state, at the same time making light of an organization that had no trouble killing innocent people, as happened in the Brighton bomb. I mean, some of these are just women who happen to be married to conservative politicians. They may not have even been conservatives themselves. Look, I'm married to you, and I would never dream of voting for the Conservative Party. To be a Conservative member is itself not a crime, is not an illegitimate thing, and certainly is not worthy of attack. And of course, I mean, we don't need to go through all of the crimes of the IRA here today, but this is an organization that killed pregnant women, that killed children, and to see them as some kind of funny joke to wind up British people is really, in my view, truly beyond the pale. So by the time that the dust clears, in this case literally, of the devastation of the Grand Hotel, and you just say Margaret Thatcher's at this police college in Lewes. She's now learning of deaths. She's seen on television that a member of her cabinet has been severely injured. She does not know if other members of her government have been killed. Is it at that point that she then thinks, right, conference is over, we've got to go back to London and regroup and reassess?
The remarkable thing is that she doesn't seem to consider for a moment the idea that the conference will not go on. Certainly, of course, if she had taken Robin Butler's advice and gone back to London, then I think that would have been it. But she is remarkably steely about this. And still in the morning, she speaks to the press and says the conference will go on as usual, and then emphasizes those words, as usual. She does not want anything about how the Conservative Party has planned the events to be undone or changed in response to terrorist acts. She becomes fixated on it starting at the same time, for example, and everybody being ready to start at the same time. So it's just 6.5 hours after the bomb went off that the conference begins, and she walks out onto the stage. She's barely slept, probably an hour or so, when they were at the police college in Lewes. The only deviation from the planned schedule is that there's a moment's silence. By this time, it is clear that people had died. There is a prayer that is said, and then the conference begins, somewhat ironically, with the first issue on the agenda for that day being a debate on Northern Ireland. The big climax of the conference was always due to be the Prime Minister's speech, and that goes ahead as planned in the afternoon. The speech is different in two ways. She does take out some of the more partisan attacks that she was planning to make in the speech, and she does also, of course, make reference to the bomb attack itself. On the bomb attack itself, she says, "The bomb attack on the Grand Hotel early this morning was first and foremost an inhuman, undiscriminating attempt to massacre innocent, unsuspecting men and women staying in Brighton for our Conservative conference. It was an attempt not only to disrupt and terminate our conference, it was an attempt to cripple Her Majesty's democratically elected government. That is the scale of the outrage in which we have all shared, and the fact that we are gathered here now, shocked but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attacks to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail." So you can see there really the justification she's making for carrying on the conference and being utterly determined that nothing should change. One thing that's really interesting about her speech is the closing section of it, because it's not clear to me whether or not, when she says it, these are new words that she has in mind in response to the bomb, or whether in fact these are words that she is using in response to the ongoing miners' strike at the time. So she says, "The nation faces what is probably the most testing crisis of our time, the battle between extremists and the rest. We are fighting, as we have always fought, for the weak as well as for the strong. We are fighting for great and good causes. We are fighting to defend them against the power and might of those who rise up to challenge them. This government will not weaken. This nation will meet that challenge. Democracy will prevail." There's almost, in Margaret Thatcher's response to this, I think, an unhuman steeliness. And I don't say that critically or unkindly. It's remarkable, really, the way in which she ploughs on and goes on. It's not what I think any of our initial instincts would be. And in some ways, I suspect on some level it's not what she would have really wanted to do at all. Of course, this has happened. What better than to speed off to Chequers, for example, and know that you're safe and take time to recover and not have the burden of making this speech in this really fraught and highly emotionally charged context. But I think it is a sign really of her as a remarkable leader that she never gives in to that sense and does go on with it as planned.
I mean, it's a political masterstroke to do it. I think also taking a step back from politics and just thinking about as a moment for our country, whatever you might think of Margaret Thatcher and her policies, and I don't hold them in high regard at all. And I do think that, for example, the way that she handled the miners' strike during that time was terrible. To look, obviously, I didn't live through it, but to look at that moment, it's a moment of great, I think, maybe pride for the resilience of the British political system in the face of an attack that is designed to destroy it through political violence. And I think it's absolutely essential we always stand up against political violence, and we must not allow political violence to disrupt the normal continuation of our political system. And by having the conference as planned, as she declared, was a powerful demonstration of that. I don't know if a prime minister would be able to do that today, or certainly I think there would be probably much, much greater pressure from the security staff who would say, look, you're putting lives at risk potentially by carrying on with conference, and say, no, it's important to carry on. You know, this was not a risk-free decision that she made. And look, you know, I mean, if a bomb had gone off in the conference hall that day, we didn't know necessarily if they had 3 weeks before put another bomb in the roof of the convention, of the conference hall, right? People might have looked on that and said how reckless it was. So politics requires tough decisions. It requires bravery. It requires weighing off the risks and the choices. And Margaret Thatcher, in making the decision she did, it's tough, you say, potentially almost inhuman, but it was a masterstroke move. Do we know how it affected her personally? I mean, you have to think, if you have come so close to death as she did, if you have had death all around you because you are the target, I think it must do something to your psychology. I mean, we don't know, for example, quite how Donald Trump's assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania in July of 2024 changed him. But I have to think that after a bullet whizzed through his ear and people around him were killed, and how he came just within a flinch of death, that will have affected his sense of his own purpose and resolve, perhaps. Do we know if something happened similar to Margaret Thatcher?
My own view of it is that longer term, there were not particularly profound consequences on her, how she thought about being in government and how she operated as a political leader. The moment at which she seems to have really begun to process what happened seems to be a few days later. So after her speech, she does go up to Chequers. It's her 59th birthday the following day. And then at church 2 days later, she apparently cried over it for the first time and reflected that this is the day I was not meant to see. And she would write subsequently about having never known such a blend of gratitude and sorrow. Of course, gratitude for the fact that she is still there, but sorrow for the fact that people weren't, and that people were still in hospital and suffering from their injuries. There are a couple of small ways in which she apparently changed her practices afterwards. So it's said that if she was ever staying in a strange house, she would carry a torch, just in case there was a bomb attack and she needed to be able to find her way out. And it's also said that when she hosted the Irish Prime Minister at Chequers the following month, that she slept with her door open, which is quite remarkable given that she was in Chequers at the time, and the risk of a bomb, you would have thought, is extraordinarily low, because she was worried that if something did happen, she didn't want to be trapped, like the Howes were in Brighton, in her room, so she kept the door open instead.
You know, I hadn't thought about that, but of course, when a bomb goes off in the middle of the night, the electricity goes and there's no lights. You can't just flick the switch of the lights on to see. And in those days, people didn't have their mobile phones, which were doubling as torches. So you would be feeling around in the dark. The bits of the hotel where the floor had gone, and you know, if you're crawling around and don't see where you're going, you're at risk of literally falling to your death. So this just adds another element to the horror of the situation. Obviously, what the IRA was trying to do, in addition to killing the Prime Minister and her cabinet, was to change British policy in Northern Ireland? What effect did the Brighton bomb, if anything, if any, have on the UK government's Northern Ireland policies?
I would argue very little, except it, if anything, slowed down the journey that the British and the Irish governments in particular were on. So, as I mentioned earlier on, in spite of the rhetoric, particularly from some people in the Republican movement, that she was some utterly unbending figure, she was actually quite pragmatic and actually quite conciliatory on questions about Northern Ireland. As I mentioned, just a month after this, she met Garret Fitzgerald, the Irish Prime Minister, and hosted him at Chequers. And a year later, the Anglo-Irish Agreement would be signed. And it was that agreement that gave the government of the Republic of Ireland some say, albeit limited say, in the affairs of Northern Ireland. What the bomb may have done, and in fact almost certainly did do, is slow the progress down towards that agreement. So she wrote a note just afterwards to say that the bomb may in the end kill any new initiative about for the situation in Northern Ireland. And she was particularly conscious of now the need to go, quote, very slow on these talks, if not stop them. And the entire reason for that is that she did not want it to seem as if Republican terrorists had planted a bomb that had therefore changed the course of British statecraft and policymaking. And so, in fact, she took her foot off the accelerator, so to speak, on these negotiations with the Irish in response to this. And in fact, the Republicans would have got a little bit of what they wanted sooner had this never have happened.
And it goes to show that actually these people did not bring about peace and reconciliation or recognition for the, if they said they were standing up for the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, which I don't believe they really were, that they were not actually helping their cause. If anything, they were hindering the cause. Now, we've made a decision on this podcast today to not name the murderer who was responsible for this. Tell us about how the murderer ultimately was apprehended.
Yes, so the person who planted the bomb is known. The reason why we've chosen not to really mention him on this podcast is that a lot of the time when the Brighton bomb is discussed, he is made out to be some sort of great celebrity in the story, not helped by the fact that he is still alive, unlike 5 of the people who were caught up in this, and does do media interviews, etc., about it, something I personally find really loathsome and objectionable. He was happily caught, in part because there was a cache of IRA equipment that had been found in the January of the year with multiple timers, all set for the same duration. But one of these timers were numbered. One of them appeared to be missing. And so when the bomb went off, the police counted back the days from when these timers were set and thought that if one of these timers had been used, then the person who checked into the hotel would have done so, or certainly would have been there around the 17th of September. They looked at the rooms around the epicenter of the blast, 628, 629, 528, 529, looked at who had been staying in those rooms around then, and they saw the name Roy Walsh, which was the alias that had been used by the terrorist, was also the name, as I mentioned, of a former convicted IRA bomber. And they quickly did some digging, discovered that that was a fake name that had used a fake address, looked at the card that had been signed when checking in, got a partial palm print from it, and that eventually told them who it was. So the terrorist had himself been arrested when he was living in Norfolk. And happily, the police had on record his fingerprints and his palm print.
And as you mentioned, Lee, this killer is still alive, is free, and is doing media interviews. And the reason for that is because he was one of the many criminals and murderers who was released from prison as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, something that's, given this kind of sanctified universal praise for ending the troubles in Northern Ireland. And I don't discount its important place in history, but there is this really quite gut-wrenching element to the Good Friday Agreement, which is that it allowed people who had killed innocent men, women, and children to walk free and to live a life that they had denied to people who never deserved to die.
Yes, so in 1986, he was convicted for 8 life sentences. As it happens, he was arrested by British police forces in the process of planting more bombs in hotels in the United Kingdom that would have gone on to murder more innocent people. It was said at the time of his conviction that he should serve a minimum of 35 years before being considered for parole. And in 1997, that was converted to a whole life order, meaning that he would never be released. But like you say, he was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And it's not something we can get into in this episode itself. But I think what's really just important to note about that is that as time passes on and we look back at history in more shallow ways, we tend to think of people as heroes or villains and events as obviously virtuous or obviously heinous. A lot of the nuance that accompanies politics and policy making and decision making in statecraft can often be easily forgotten as time passes on. And the point I do just want to make about the Good Friday Agreement is that it has undoubtedly played an important role in getting Northern Ireland to a stable and much more peaceful position. And even if the price of peace is enormous, including doing things like releasing murderers, which I personally find deeply morally objectionable, then if the prize at the end of that is peace and fewer bombs in cars and hotels and fewer people murdered by terrorists, then that may be a weight worth bearing. But these decisions aren't easy, and the weight of decision making in areas like Northern Ireland and on questions like securing long-term peace, I think is an enormous burden on everybody who was ever involved in doing that.
What would you say, Lee, was the long-term legacy of the Brighton bomb?
I think in terms of our politics, it probably did not have a particularly long legacy in some respects. So I don't think it changed Margaret Thatcher. Of course, it didn't kill her or very senior members of her government in the way it intended, and that would have immediately changed the nature of British politics. We discussed about Norman Tebbit and his potential role as a successor. That's undoubtedly one of the what ifs of this whole saga, that it took him out of the running to take over from her years later, but it is impossible to know. I think also on Northern Ireland and the negotiations for the Anglo-Irish Agreement and subsequent negotiations in Northern Ireland, I don't think it really changed much either. Like I say, if anything, it just slowed things down. Where it did, I think, make a change was about the greater security around British politicians. In particular, of course, the Prime Minister, but also senior members of the cabinet as well, and also events like party conferences, which are now extraordinarily highly protected. And I think the government was conscious afterwards of the need to try and strike a balance. So Leon Britton, who was the Home Secretary, said in the Commons shortly afterwards that in a free democratic society, political and other leaders are vulnerable because they must be accessible. Everything that can be done will be done to prevent such outrages and to protect their targets, but we will not be bombed into bolt holes by terrorists. And I think the spirit of what he says there is the absolute correct one. And it is, of course, something which, with the atrocities that have come in the years since, the murder of people like Ian Gow by the IRA, but also much more recently, the murder of Joe Cox, the murder of Sir David Amess, it is still a balance between the accessibility of politicians and protection for politicians that we're still wrestling with and trying to get correct today.
We finished this episode in the way that we normally do by reflecting on the books that we recommend to our listeners this week. I'll go first. So my book this week is Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights by Glenda Gilmore. This is an extraordinary book about the history of the American civil rights movement in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, with a particular look at the Communist Party in the United States and in the Soviet Union, and the efforts of communists in the Soviet Union to recruit African-American political activists and African-American political activists in the United States to try to organize the Black community to support and join the communist movement. You have to remember, of course, that at the end of the First World War, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, you have this sort of sense of a proletariat who is rising up in the Soviet Union against the ruling class. And there was a view among some in the Soviet Union and the African American community that something similar might be able to happen in the American South. As it turned out, this proved to be much, much more difficult. The Communist Party was not particularly attractive for many in the rural South. The book writes about how really it's urban African Americans in cities like New York and Chicago who, to the extent that there is attraction to communism, they're the ones who join, and they really struggle to get Black agricultural workers to join the Communist Party, although there is some evidence of communist organizing in the South. It's a very, very, very well-researched book. I'm absolutely amazed at the amount of research that Glenda Gilmore put into this book. She spent time not just traveling throughout the United States and looking at archives in the US, but also went to Russia and actually other parts of the world to do the research. It's a bit of I would call it Caro-esque. It reminds me a bit of a Robert Caro book in its level of detail and focus on lots and lots of kind of individual kind of side stories to give you a flavor of the people and the time. And for that reason, sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating if you just want to get the kind of more salient political details. But if you're looking for a book to immerse yourself in a political time and world that maybe you hadn't otherwise thought much about, then I can recommend Defying Dixie by Glenda Gilmore. Lee, what is your book this week?
Well, speaking of absolute doorstoppers, I've just started reading Attlee and Churchill, the namesakes of this podcast, Allies in War, Adversaries in Peace by Leo McKinstry. And what I'm finding so far is that this is a really interesting book for fleshing out the similarities and shared experiences, but also the striking differences between these two men, really the people who, of course, worked together to lead Britain throughout the Second World War, and also then fought the early political battles of the post-war period, the 1945, 50 and 51 general election, also 1955 in Attlee's case, just after Churchill's resignation. So the book is long, it's arguably too long, but it does have lots of nice, rich detail in there, and also brings out different elements of the characters of the people. So, for example, one of the points that is made very early on is about how Churchill had this radical side to his character, which actually was rather more difficult for people to see with Attlee. Attlee clearly had the radical politics in terms of what the state would do and would do for people, but actually in his personal demeanour, that was rather less obvious. So Robert Menzies, the great Australian Prime Minister, once recalled Churchill, the Conservative, always looked and sounded like a crusader. Attlee, the Socialist, looked and sounded like a company director. Not necessarily what you'd expect from one of the best-known Conservatives and most iconic socialists in post-war British politics. We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode. We'll be back on Thursday with the next instalment of Matters of Interest, our midweek episode that looks at something that's piqued our curiosity in the week beforehand. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.